Buenas tardes, estimados alumnos. Me da mucho gusto estar con ustedes por estos pocos momentos que vamos a estar juntos por medio de este video. Good evening or afternoon, my wonderfully esteemed students. It brings me great pleasure to be with you all for the next few moments. We're going to be together via this video. And I say evening or afternoon, depending on the time you view this video. Just a couple of updates. So what I hope to do in this chapter, in this presentation, is provide you all a very general and cursory overview over some of the concepts, some of the key takeaways, and some of the key insights that can be drawn from the chapters that you should have just read thus far, chapters 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Each of these chapters is dealing in some way with an idea of inequality, which is basically where many of the problems associated with each of these constructs arises from. So you have in chapter 3 racial inequality, in chapter 4 gender inequality, and then also in chapter 5 inequality related to someone's sexual orientation. So that's the kind of the key broad overview. Again, I'm not going to be able to provide a very detailed and nuanced lecture on each and every single key idea or key concept or key vocabulary term, because I would turn this 1 hour lecture into, or hopefully it's less than an hour, but it would turn this lecture into like a 3 or 4 hour lecture. And I know all of us are very busy. I know all of you are very busy and don't have really all the time in the world to just sit down and listen to me talk about something that you're reading about in your book already. So my job is to help you better understand the key ideas, break them down in some ways, but certainly not to make this elementary, right? Not to take up your time by regurgitating information that you're already consuming as you read the academic text. Okay. All right. So that being said, as I was sharing with you all, we're looking at systems of inequality related to race, to gender, and sexual orientation. And a really important idea associated with that inequality is that our society, and any society, distributes resources and access to resources and access to opportunity along various stratified lines. Okay, it's called they're called systems of stratification. And that's basically where that inequality stems from. So your race, our racial identity, our racial identification, and our racial group membership determines the degree to which we experience inequality in a racialized society. The same thing with gender. Your gender or your sex will influence your access to opportunities, your access to resources based on your sex and your gender. And then also even our sexual orientation influences our access to opportunities and our access to resources. And the resources that we are looking at are threefold, okay? The resources we're looking at are not just related to material resources. There are certainly material resources, but there are also other types of resources, which are immaterial resources, which are basically emotional resources and symbolic resources. And the thing that I want to really bring to everyone's attention right now is that our access to material, emotional, and symbolic resources is distributed unequally in our society. It's distributed unequally along racial lines, it's distributed unequally along gender lines, and it's distributed unequally. Those resources and immaterial and material resources are distributed unequally along the gender or the sexual orientation lines, okay? So just to give you all as an example of how this works, right? So historically, if you're looking at it just from a racial perspective, historically, Mexican Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans have been given access to material resources in very disparate and disadvantaged ways, right? So when we talk about material resources, we're talking about wealth, primarily wealth and income, right? How much wealth accumulation a person can engage in and what kind of income they derive from the work of their labor. Historically, these non-white racial ethnic groups or ethnic groups have historically been given very unequal incomes and historically been limited in their ability to accumulate wealth that's not commensurate with the effort of their labor or certainly with that of their white peers. So historically, being a white American in the United States has afforded one an opportunity to historically accumulate resources at advantage rates that people of color have not been given access to. So the material resources are wealth and income. but your wealth and your income influences the quality of housing, the type of housing, the area you live in, where your housing is located, the kind of clothes you wear, the kind of food you have access to, the kind of medicine you have access to, and the kind of education you have access to. So when you begin to look at these systems of inequalities, these systems of stratification of just the material resources that people of color racially have been afforded, you do see that people of color have, and it extends to other things too, because your wealth and your income influences your education, right? Historically, people of color, communities of color have not been given the same resources to fund their educational systems. So yes, they get to go to school after Brown versus Board of Education, sometimes with white people, but by and large, people of color have not been given a quality education since time immemorial. And as a matter of fact, in some parts of our history, people were outright denied an education, people of color, right? Not just Black slaves, Mexican, for example, are another population. So you have those dynamics. So the material resources that groups are given access to, chiefly wealth and income, influences what kind of other things they get exposure to and access to in terms of resources and in terms of opportunity. And then alongside that, you have these immaterial resources. So for example, the emotional resources that we need to be able to thrive and to grow into healthy, well-developed human beings. So affection, warmth, physical contact, okay? Just think about the ways in which people of color get treated by law enforcement, generally speaking, when you find that people of color on the highway are disproportionately pulled over in rates higher than their white counterparts. Black Americans can have their hands up and get shot by police officers, right? So they don't generally, people of color have historically not received a lot of affection. We've had lynchings, we've had murders, we've had, so for example, I'll give you another, just a story that happened just a few years ago, but was really kind of classic to just show you how emotional resources are denied people of color historically. And it's not just Blacks, it's Mexican Americans as well. But there was a young man who was selling cigarettes, individual cigarettes in New York on a street corner just a few years ago, and some law enforcement officers attempted to stop him. They put him in a chokehold and they killed him, right? They killed him, certainly not intentional, but they took his life because he was selling cigarettes, individualized cigarettes. Now you compare that to Dylan Roof, who was a white supremacist in the South, recently as well, probably like 2015, 2016, but he went into a Southern Baptist church, or an African-American church, and he shot 9 people inside this church. He killed them. And when he was arrested, he was given Burger King by the arresting officers because they saw that he hadn't eaten. So a white American who murders 9 Black people in a church can be extended affection by saying, oh my gosh, you haven't eaten. But a Black individual who's selling individualized cigarettes on a street corner can be choked to death, right? Or you think of the Chauvin case, right? The Derek Chauvin case, the George Floyd case. You think of Trayvon Martin case. You think of, for example, what happened with the young man in the documentary Shenandoah. But either way, so people of color historically have been historically denied emotional resources. The physical contact and the warmth that's necessary to thrive and become a healthy human being, it's denied, maybe not overtly at times, but also as a result of the fact that they have low wages and are given low income. So parents of children of color, right? Parents of color don't get to spend time with their children and give them the physical contact and the warmth they need because they're consistently being given wages that are lower than their white counterparts, or other they're occupy particular sectors of the economy that don't pay them as lucratively as other sectors of the economy that they could be participating in. And as a result of that, they're denied the time that they need to provide their children the warmth and the physical contact. You think of the school to prison pipeline, or the mass incarceration of people of color, the warmth and the physical contact of a father. It's being really denied communities of color historically because, we can't build prisons fast enough for brown and Black people, brown and Black fathers, actually, brown and Black men. If you're a person of color, if you're a male of color, there's a real great risk of incarceration in your livelihood, in your lifetime. And And that's not a coincidence, because historically people of color have not just been denied educations, but they've also been denied access to an education that's going to leave them economically viable. Okay, because and if you're not economically viable, then there's a likelihood of an incarceration, because illegitimate opportunity structures begin to present themselves. Or, for example, you increasingly don't have the resources to defend yourself from the criminal justice system. Okay, and then last but not least, you also have the symbolic resources, access that's unequal to symbolic resources, like the esteem, the status, and the prestige. So historically, if you're looking at it from a racial perspective, people of color have not been held in very high esteem. People of color have had stereotypes attached to them, saying that they're more criminal or more dangerous or less intelligent, right? And I say that even the model minority myth associated with Asian Americans is an accurate myth that denies them some of the esteem and some of the prestige that historically white Americans have just been given kind of carte blanche. Okay, carte blanche, basically a blank check for them being given these things. So, and then the other thing too is, your access to material resources influences your ability to get emotional and symbolic resources, because when you have a lot of money, people do treat you warmer. People do treat you with esteem. You do have more status or prestige with money, right? Because you can afford the nice clothes, you have the nice house, you have a good education, et cetera, et cetera. So that being said, you could also extend the same logic that I was discussing to any of the other areas discussed in chapters 4 and 5, right? So gender, females, it's called the feminization of poverty. Females have historically been denied the opportunity, or actually have been historically given lower wages than their male counterparts. You have an increasing majority of people in poverty being females, and that's not a coincidence. Not only do they have lower wages, but you have the timeout factor associated with pregnancy or childbearing, and then also the maternal roles that females historically have had to play without sometimes the support of their male counterparts. And so you have gendered inequality. You have gendered inequality that's access to material resources, emotional resources. You have domestic violence, you have sexual harassment, you have rape, you have murder, you have stalking. You can extend that to any number of big ideas associated with what we just talked about in terms of the inequality, and even the symbolic. If you're curious about whether or not women are symbolically afforded equality, just think about the fact that most of the time, when someone's going to have a child, they're asked, well, is it a boy or a girl? And if they say it's a girl, you often hear, girls are so much harder. Or if it's a boy, they'll say, oh, you're so lucky because girls are so much harder, right? So there's this gendered inequality built in even in the language that people use around men and women. And then last but not least, what I'll share with you in this chart is, and I want to call your attention to it using my mouse. What you're looking at here, this is just to highlight the gendered and going back to before I talk about the chart, one last thing in chapter 5, it talks about sexual orientation. The emotional and symbolic resources that homosexuals or members of the LGBTQ community are denied are historical. Like historically, homosexuals and other members of the LGBTQ community are not afforded emotional resources. They're not afforded physical safety because they have higher rates of being victimized or being assaulted, of being murdered. They have higher rates of suicide, of mental health issues, right? They're not held in esteem generally, which is why so many individuals struggle with coming out of the closet and presenting themselves as their sexual orientation dictates. So gender inequality and inequality associated with sex and with sexual orientation, as well as race, is all part and parcel of these chapters. And so, that being said, one last example before I move on to some of the other key ideas. Like I said, I don't want this lecture to be very long. This is just highlighting for you all how real this is. Okay, so what you're looking at here on the left side is a column that says the educational attainment going up from less than a high school, so a high school dropout, beginning with a high school dropout and ending with professional certification. So just so you all know, professional certification is usually above and beyond a doctoral degree. It's a doctorate, a Juris Doctorate, it's a law degree, it's a medical doctorate, it's a medical degree, it's a dentist degree, those kind of degrees, okay? Now, if you look these next columns, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 columns. The first column, well, actually, let's go look at the first 2 columns. The first 2 columns are looking at a racial difference in terms of the earnings for men who are white and men who are Hispanic. And it does that, it compares the earnings for these individuals, the wages for these individuals based on the level of educational attainment they have. So a high school dropout who happens to be white and is male is could anticipate earning $27,000 a year. A Hispanic male who drops out of high school can anticipate making about $7,000 less. So the third column is actually showing the gap, right? And you'll notice that the gap actually widens the more educational attainment that Hispanic men acquire. Okay, so a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, Hispanics should go to school so they can earn more. Well, the reality is the more education that Hispanic males earn, the wider the gap gets between them and their white male counterparts. Okay, which should be shocking to all of us. Okay, I want to call your attention to, for example, this idea here. If you look, this a white male who gets a master's degree. So a master's degree is, okay, you got your 2-year associates, you got 2 more years for your bachelor's, that's 4 years. Your master's degree generally is anywhere between 2 to 3 years. So you're looking at about 6 or 7 years of schooling for a white male to be able to earn about $62,000. And I want you to look at this. What happens is a Hispanic male who gets the same level of education is looking at earning a little less than $12,000 less than that white male. And what's even crazier is a Hispanic male can go on to get a doctorate and still earn less. So a doctorate is another 4, 5, or 6 years. Okay, right. So I've got my doctorate. It took another 5, close to 5 years beyond my master's degree as well as my bachelor's degree. But a Hispanic male can go on and get a doctorate degree, which is now looking at anywhere be like, what are you looking at? You're looking at 4 years for your BA. You can have 2 years for your master's. You're looking at another 4 to 5. A Hispanic male can go to school for 11 to 12 years and still earn less than a white male who goes to school for 6. That should be jaw-dropping. That should be sobering to all of us. And now it's even more pronounced when you start looking at the gender gap between women and men, white men and white women. So the last 3 columns are looking at white and Hispanic women. So when you look at this gap, this is an even more pronounced gap. Okay, let's just look at a woman who goes on to get a doctorate degree. A white woman who goes on to get a doctorate degree can anticipate making about $59,000 a year. That is still less than a white male who goes to school for 6 years. So a white woman can go to school for 12 years and earn less than a white male who goes to school for 6. That's the inequality we're going to be talking about in these chapters. It's related to race, it's related to gender, it's related to sexual orientation. Okay, so I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can through these presentations. Chapter 3 is looking at race and ethnicity. So the first thing I want to call your attention to is race. Race is, and really race is the stories we tell about other people who are a part of a particular group that looks a particular way, right? So it's a perceived biologically inherited traits, skin color, hair color, facial features. It's called phenotypical features, which are basically the chromosomal manifestations at the surface of the DNA and the genetics that we present. Race is perceived as a social construct, which is basically, it's the stories we construct around people who look a particular way and what they think, what they look like, how they act, and who they are. Okay. When we talk about race, there's also an understanding that racial categorizations are hierarchical. So associated with conversations around race, there's this understanding of inferiority or superiority, trustworthiness or untrustworthiness. So if you think about historically in the United States, we've had a racial hierarchy, a tri-racial hierarchy with whites at the top historically. And what the definition of whites are or who whites are has historically evolved and changed and adapted to demographic shifts within the United States. But you've historically had whites at the top, and then you've had like these middle various racial ethnic populations. Like, so for example, Asian Americans, which are perceived as more assimilable than, for example, Black Americans or African Americans or Native Americans. Native Americans sometimes have occupied the middle too, or Latinos, for example, historically also. So at the bottom, usually at the bottom of this racial hierarchy has been Black Americans, African Americans. And so you've got that conversation going. Now, one thing I want to call your attention to, though, is, and I've given you some pictures here, is that really what we're looking at when we're talking about race is historically just the level of melanin that is developed in a particular person's body as a response to the exposure that they have to ultraviolet rays in the sun, right? So your body produces melanin as a way to preserve the organism that you are, and the closer you are to the equator, the more likely it is that you're going to have higher degrees of melanin historically, right? You have something called clines, which is these population groups that reproduce within particular populations and ultimately lead to the same kind of manifestations, phenotypical manifestations of dominant and recessive traits that kind of come to the surface in any one of us. Another thing I want to kind of mention to you is, like, for example, even facial features like the almond-shaped eyes historically associated with Asian Americans, whether Japanese, Taiwanese, Chinese, Korean, et cetera, that's associated with the historical accumulation and development and distribution of fat along the facial features that people have. So it's really related to the dietary consumption of a low-fat diet that leads to a different facial phenotypical features for some populations than others, right? So if you're eating a lot of menudo and you eat menudo for millennia, then you're going to have your fat distributed along your body in a different way than you would if you were Asian and you were eating predominantly low-fat diets, like subsisting of rice and, for example, fish, which historically has happened in particular regions of Asian American communities. Okay. All right. So that being said, as you go on, a lot of conversations around race are related to inequality and an imbalance in terms of access to power. All right. When we talk about ethnicity, that's a different thing. Okay. Ethnicity is actually looking at the historical heritage and cultural heritage that any particular ethnic group possesses, any group of human beings possess. So it's religious practices, its language, its values, beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. When we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about the historical cultural heritage of a particular group of people, irrespective of the racial categorization or the racial identification. So here you have two white, if you think about it in terms of race, you have two white people, but they're two very different ethnicities. You have a Hasidic Jew and you have an Irish person, right? Those are two white individuals, but they're different ethnicities. Same race, different ethnicities. The same thing here. You have a Black Jamaican. This is the Black Jamaican beauty queen. She was Miss Jamaica, I think, in like 2012, 2013. And you have a Black American. Now, remember, American is not necessarily an ethnicity, it's a nationality. And that's kind of the ambiguity, for example, around Black Americans, because Black Americans have historically had their culture taken from them. It's very difficult for that culture, that ethnic group, to be able to recapture what was taken from them through the enslavement of their people and really the destruction of their cultural identities. Okay, but here you have two Black women, in terms of racial categorization, you have two Black women, but they are very different in terms of their ethnic identities. All right, so now a couple of other examples here when we to kind of compare and contrast race. When we talk about race, we're talking about something that's externally imposed. It's generally related to power, and it's usually involuntarily externally imposed on a particular minority population. A minority population is not related to numbers, it's related to the power differential between a dominant group and a minority population. Race is hierarchical and it has moral implications. So, for example, historically, Mexican Americans have been seen as dangerous, as drug dealers, as more currently illegal, undocumented, cholos, right? Gangbangers, these kind of things, these kind of representations. So there's moral implications for particular racial categories. You know, whiteness is afforded innocence. As I gave you the example of Dylann Roof, who went and shot 9 people, and then the sheriff, law enforcement agents fed him a Burger King meal, where other Black individuals can have their hands up and get shot and killed, or choked to death by a police officer with no fallout. So There are moral implications. Historically, people of color have been viewed as dangerous. White Americans have been viewed as innocent, as intelligent. People of color, not so much. And that's kind of the perceptions that are associated with the racial categorizations and the stereotypes that take place. Race is also very exclusive. It's either it's an in-group, out-group dynamic. You're black or you're white. You're not like both. You know, like if you think about President Barack Obama, he wasn't called the first white American. He wasn't called the first black white American. He was called the first black African American president, right? He was the first black president. And so there's this exclusivity associated with it. When we talk about ethnicity, it's a little bit different in that ethnicity is voluntary. People can ethnically choose to identify who they are. And you see some of this with the symbolic ethnicity associated with, for example, St. Patrick's Day. White Americans, you can't tell if one white American is Irish or Italian, generally speaking, or Hungarian or whatever. But if they're celebrating their ethnicity, they can come out and say, I'm Irish, right? Or I'm Hungarian. And there's no hierarchy, okay? It's very planar. There's ethnicity is everyone's on equal footing. Every ethnicity is kind of like the same in terms of their value or their esteem. Like you're not better if you're German than if you're Irish, right? As an example. And then also ethnicity is fluid and multiple. Like you can have multiple ethnicities, you know. President Barack Obama was, actually Tiger Woods was defined himself as Cablinasian, right? So he was Asian, and by the way, Asian is a racial categorization, but and it consists of all these different types of populations like Japanese, Korean, South Vietnamese, Filipina, like Taiwanese, all these different kind of things. But Cablinasian was the term that Tiger Woods came up with to just kind of identify the multiple fluid identities associated with his ethnic identification. Okay, some groups can be both, and that actually happens with the process of racialization that's associated with, for example, what happened to the Jews during World War II. All right, so your book in chapter 3 talks about some of the sources of prejudice. So you know, our prejudices are learned, they're taught, usually through the process of socialization in our family, religion, education, especially now media. A lot of times the media disseminates very inaccurate images. So, for example, when you hear about stories about Latinos or Mexican Americans or people coming from the South America, they're dangerous, they're threats, they're illegal, they're criminals, they're dirty, like all these different kind of stereotypes. When you know, a lot of times some of these individuals are coming with very high levels of education. You know, I knew a doctor, a medical doctor, from Mexico who came as an undocumented immigrant, but he was a highly intelligent, very respectful, very law-abiding individual. You know, he was here, I think he'd been here like 20 years, and he had a very high level of education. He was very respectful, very kind, and very compassionate. And he wasn't any of the things that stereotypes put out to be, right? So some of the stereotypes of Mexican Americans is like, why don't they speak English? You're looking at a Mexican American, a Chicano. I speak both English and Spanish, right? But that's not the thing that's presented in the media. What's presented in the media is Mexicans don't speak English, or Mexicans don't value education. When I have a doctorate, right? So, so that's just some of the ways in which we acquire our prejudices. Also, there's cognition that goes on. There's a lot of cognitive science that has determined that our prejudices are derived from the neurological activity that takes place between the limbic system and the executive prefrontal cortex. And our prejudice is actually twofold, okay? You have a cognitive dynamic to it, and then you have an affective dynamic to it. So the cognitive component to prejudice is like the knowledge that you possess associated with any particular racial or ethnic group that's different from yourself. But what you think about other people, right? How you think about other people based on your prejudices or based on your understandings of who people are, affects your emotions and how you feel about them. And how you feel about them is going to ultimately determine your actions, which is when we talk about prejudice leading to the dynamic of discrimination. But to just kind of highlight how prejudice is a process of the socialization for us all, here's an example of a news story. Now, this is the same news story, the same situation. There was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. At the very top with the Associated Press, you see an African-American young man. And the story says that a young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans, okay? So a Black young man is looting a store. And then you see two white individuals. Remember I was talking about earlier how white Americans are afforded innocence, or goodness? And that's not necessarily extended to people of color, whether they're Black or Mexican American or some other minority population. 2 residents wade through chest deep water after finding bread and soda. So here you find, if you're white, you found food. If you're Black, you must have stolen it. Like, that's the narrative that leads to the prejudices we have. And the danger in that is that if you don't have relationships with people who are different from yourselves, all we have are the stories that are told to us about other people. And then all we know about other people is this prejudicial bias that is built into whatever stories told to us about other people, right? So, and as I said before, historically, people of color have not had a very good story told about them. Okay. So just a few of the theories that are presented in your book, there's quite a number of them, but one of them that I want to just kind of mention is the scapegoat theory. And scapegoat theory, as we talked about, as talked about in your book, is really just the theory that basically looks at people's troubles, people's economic situation, a nation's economic situation, or a nation's decline, and then begins to blame some racial, ethnic, and sometimes maybe even religious minority. And it's usually a very powerless group. Okay, it's usually a highly identifiable group. So during World War II in Germany, after Germany was lost in World War I, it became Jews. But in the United States, it's undocumented immigrants. So usually it's people without power. It's usually people without a lot of resources that get basically scapegoated. So that's scapegoat theory. People will look to the most vulnerable and the least powerful, the most powerless group, and begin to blame this group for all of the problems that are present in people's lives or in the nation's life. At the collapse of the Roman Empire, it was Christians that were blamed for the collapse and the decline of that state. Okay, so your book discusses, we've already talked about prejudice, okay? Now remember, prejudice is a way of thinking. It's the thoughts that we have. Discrimination are the actions we take as a result of the thoughts that we have, okay? When we talk about discrimination, we can talk about it as an individualized act. So individual discrimination is one thing. We also have group discrimination, or what is called structural or institutional discrimination. And it really is basically the unequal or disparate treatment of various populations. What discrimination does is, and there's various levels to it, but what discrimination does is it denies people access to resources and opportunities, material and immaterial, like I talked about earlier. So institutional discrimination, just to kind of give you an example of what this is, it's really built into the normal interactions within any particular institution that we have. And what it does is it perpetuates the inequalities, because you know individual discrimination has declined significantly. Like, if you are a bigot, if you're a racist or a sexist, I mean, you could think about, there's institutional discrimination associated with race, sexual orientation, or gender. But if you think about it, if you're an open bigot, right, an open discriminatory individual, you're going to lose your job. You know, so you have closeted bigots, people that don't. So individual discrimination has declined relatively since at least the 1960s. You know, like, individualized acts of discrimination are not as common. But what we do have now is what's called institutional discrimination. Now, institutional discrimination is really, it leads to the same end result, which is an unequal access to opportunities and resources for people or communities of color, or people who are being discriminated against, with, let's say, for example, females or homosexuals. But it actually takes away the victim's opportunities to identify the source of the discrimination that's taking place. So with institutional discrimination, it's a different means to the same ends, which is, if you're Black, you will not get the same level of education that a white American gets. Or if you're a woman, you are not going to get the same promotions that a man gets. Or if you're homosexual, you will not get the same job interviews that a heterosexual gets, right? Like, so it takes away, it's a different set of means to get to the same kind of ends. And when we're looking at these dynamics, what you basically have is the ways in which this takes place is through the everyday normal interactions within any particular institution. And that's it's pretty fascinating to think about. Here are a couple of points of areas of where we have lots of evidence for institutional or structural discrimination. So, for example, in the labor markets, in the education system, in the housing and mortgage lending, which is the banks, in the criminal justice system especially, and even in healthcare, okay? And institutional discrimination has multiple points at which it can present itself. So initially in access to the institution. So when you're first getting your job, right? A good example I'll give you is Hispanics or Latinos at the university level are anywhere between 4 to 8% of all university professors are Latino, right? Like that's not because Latinos don't want to be professors, okay? Like there's something going on with their access to the institutions that they're trying to enter. Same thing with college, the same thing with getting mortgage loans, the same thing with the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera. So when you start looking, for example, at how the criminal justice system operates in communities of color, you see there's various dynamics going on that lead to some of the disproportionate arrests, incarceration, or even apprehensions that people of color have to deal with in within that domain. You know, sometimes once you get in, there's also opportunities for institutional discrimination to take place. So, for example, the wages that I talked about earlier in terms of women and in terms of racial minorities, Hispanics specifically, the evaluation of their work. A good example I'll give you is professors of color and women professors of color especially get lower student evaluations than their white male counterparts. Like all the research shows that. Like if you're a female woman teaching a university class or a college class, your student evaluations are going to be lower than if you were a white male. And the same thing for a Hispanic male. Okay. But so once let's say you get in, then you're going to start experiencing dynamics of institutional discrimination related to functioning within that domain. So the police, the treatment you get from the police, the quality of legal representation, the quality of care you receive, or the prices you receive that you're charged for the healthcare you get access to. Now, also basically moving through the domain, right? Like once you get in, let's say you get in, and now, yeah, you're making lower wages, but what about getting promoted? What about getting layoffs, right? So there's something in chapter 6, there's something, actually chapter 4, there's something called the glass ceiling, right? The glass ceiling is this cap on how high a woman can go in terms of her promotion and her increase in wages. Like a woman hits a glass ceiling, which is basically she's not able to enter some of the upper echelons of leadership within the organization that she's a part of. Or, for example, her retention. And so you have those dynamics that are taking place there. And there's various agents that operate within these institutions. So, for example, in the education system, it's teachers, it's administrators, it's other students. Within the police, the criminal justice system, it's police officers, it's prosecutors, it's judges, it's juries, it's parole boards. And so these are just some examples of the dynamics of institutional discrimination and the ways in which they present themselves. Okay. So your book in chapter 3 talks about some of the consequences of race. You've got the historical wealth gap. You've got the increased incarceration of people of color. There's just lots of different ways in which race has significant and profound consequences. Okay. Your book talks about segregation, talks about hypersegregation. Chapter 4 is related to sex and gender, and I'm going to, again, try to move through this as quickly as possible. What I want you all to see is that when we talk about sex, you have primary and secondary sex characteristics. Your primary characteristics are usually the genitalia associated with it, and then the secondary sex characteristics are everything else that comes with that. But when we talk about sex, we're talking about the anatomy. When we talk about the biological anatomy, right? Male, female. When we talk about gender, we're talking about ideas associated with the behaviors and the expectations attached to someone's genitalia, someone being born with a penis or someone being born with a vagina. And that's called masculinity or femininity historically. It's an overarching construct. Gender, like race, is a social construct as well. It's a social position. So being feminine is below being masculine in so many different ways. So even if you're in the workplace, if you're demonstrating feminine characteristics or femininity, your likelihood of getting promoted, your likelihood of receiving raises, like femininity is not associated with leadership. So, and masculinity is, there's all these constructs around what masculinity is supposed to be and how they're related to leadership. So, so gender is a social construct as well. Historically, being masculine has been rewarded at greater rates than being feminine. Okay. This individual here is his name is David Reimer. He represents a really interesting story, but shows I think the real life high risk associated consequences associated with gender inequality. So he was actually born a twin to a set of parents. At about 6 or 9 weeks, he was receiving circumcision and his penis was burned off. The doctors recommended that they just basically remove whatever was left of his penis and provide, basically create a vagina for him. They changed his name. They dressed him as a girl. His parents did this, and then they hoped for the best, right? They treated David as a female. I don't know what the name that they gave him was, but or her at this point. But unbeknownst to him, he didn't know he was a male. Right around the ages of 4 or 5, he began to try to tear off his dresses. He didn't want to go to school. And things only got worse for him. He got bullied because he began to present a much more masculine body frame than his female counterpart. He was bigger than the other little girls. And then right around 12, 13, or 14 years of age, things got so bad that his parents had to tell him that he was actually born a he, that she was actually a he. You can imagine that was pretty traumatic for him. He eventually underwent, later on in some later years, he underwent sexual reassignment. He became the male that he was born as. He got married. He tried to form a family, but he was never really able to fully recover from the trauma of what happened to him in his childhood. And he committed suicide. I think he took his own life around the ages of 34, 35. Right. So, gender and sex matter a lot. We also have a couple of ideas in your text. Sexism, right? So sexism is really the disparate and unequal treatment of usually females in our society. And it's the defense of the status quo in terms of superiority and inferiority. Just think of how a man who fathers multiple children like Flavor Flav, right, is treated and still able to go on and build their life, a good life for themselves. And this poor woman here, Tammy, who has 3 children and is really has seen her life chances inhibited as a result of being born a woman. Okay. Gender is also a cultural component. So gender influences the way we eat, the way we talk, the way we sit, the jobs we do, the way we present ourselves, the emotions we demonstrate, right? So if I, as a male, begin to cry because I get a bad haircut, my wife may begin to question my masculinity. If I am watching a football game and I turn off the TV with my friends, my homeboys, and they say, hey, you know what, let's talk about our feelings. They're probably going to throw shit at me, because that's not in line with conceptualizations of masculinity. And that might be more tolerable for females to do, right? Even the way we walk with our partners is structured and influenced and shaped by gender. Okay. A couple of other terms mentioned in your book. You have intersexed, which are individuals who are phenotypically actually ambiguous. Okay, so it's a person who has an extremely enlarged clitoris or a micropenis, which is a penis of 2 or 3 centimeters. And some individuals are born like that, a small percentage of people, but there's still people nonetheless. So individuals can be born with sexually ambiguous genitalia. And at that point, it becomes difficult for these individuals. We have also individuals who are transgender, which is basically their gender identity doesn't conform to the sexual anatomy that they're presented with, that they're born with. And as a result of that, they transgress the gender norms, right? So they begin to identify intimately with the opposite gender and perform that gender, even though their sexual anatomy is different from that, which is associated with the traditional gender role performance that they're trying to emulate. So there's that transgender. Your book also mentions the term transvestite or, for example, transsexual. A transsexual has historically been a person who undergoes sexual reassignment surgery and basically becomes the opposite sex because of their identification being so intimately associated with the opposite sex and the opposite gender. Okay. All right. So you've got that going on. These right here, these individuals are transgender. Some of them are transgender and some of them are transsexuals, although you can see that they're presenting as females. These 3 individuals were actually males at some point in their life earlier. Okay. And so as I was sharing, when we talk about transsexual, it's a person that generally undergoes sexual reassignment surgery. Okay. All right. I'm gonna keep going. My apologies if all right. So how do we get to where we're at in terms of how do we know we're males or how do we know we're females? And what does it mean, right? So we experience something called gender socialization. So socialization is the bestowing of a particular identity upon you, right? And so and there's lots of different theories. You can look at it from Freudian theory and psychoanalysis. You can look at it from sociological theories like George Herbert Mead or symbolic interactionist theory. But when we talk about gender socialization, it's the identity that we possess that comes from all these different arenas, right? So our race, our ethnicity, our social class, our age, our sexual orientation, and our religion, and the media, all impact our gender role conformity or our gender role enactment, okay? And in chapter 5, we talk a little bit about the sexual orientation piece associated with that as well, because it is very much part and parcel of gender socialization, because even the way we perform sex is part of the gender socialization process as males or females. So gender socialization is that it's your identity as a consequence of your primary and significant others interacting with you and other institutions reinforcing a particular identity upon you. Okay. Your book talks about different types of feminism. The idea that I want you all to see is that, historically there's been a liberal feminism, which is the belief that social change and equality can be mediated through and within the traditional institutional reforms that can take place within various institutions politically, within the family, within the economy, et cetera, et cetera. You also have socialist feminists, and socialist feminists are those who believe that the problem is capitalism and the economic resources that are able to be access to, or the opportunities commensurate with those resources that are the problem that lead to the gendered inequality in our society. And then you have radical feminists, which ultimately believe that the great problem is patriarchy, and that needs to be destroyed. So you've got those kind of ideas associated with this stuff. The first wave of feminism began way back with the passing of the 19th Amendment. And the suffrage movement, that women began to have access to the voting process. And that ultimately kind of shifted and shaped reshaped our political environment and the experience for women across the United States. The second wave of feminism, and I'm going to kind of keep moving here, is associated with what really took place during the civil rights movement of not just racial equality, but it's equality related to sexual orientation and then equality related to gender. So you had the second wave of feminism that really began in the 1950s and 60s, and then ultimately led to the passing, for example, of Title IX, the Title VII Civil Rights Act of 1964. And those policies have really created conditions for women that just again rearranged what life was like for women in the United States, in the workplace, in the family, and within other institutions, even within colleges, schools, and other places. So your book talks about gender segregation. The thing I want you all to kind of keep in mind is, and don't worry too much about the numbers associated with this, but because it kind of goes up and down, but the work that we do is segregated by gender. For example, the majority of teachers in the United States are females. The majority of individuals who are secretaries are females. The majority of people who engage in childcare are females. And then nursing, for example, predominantly females. So you have gender segregation, gender occupational niches that are occupied by particular people, and it leads to gender tracking. And most of that starts in school. But so some of the professions that people engage in are also part of that. We've got the idea of like what kind of occupational niches women and men occupy. Usually women are confined to secondary labor markets, which are really either auxiliary or supportive, and generally associated with lower wages, greater job insecurity, are more poorly paid or less poorly paid, and don't have as many promotions as some of these other occupational niches. A couple of other theories that are out there, because like I said, I'm trying to condense this lecture. I've already mentioned the feminization of poverty, remember, which is basically the increasing demographic of people who are poor are females. And that's not a coincidence, because females historically earn lower wages than their male counterparts. And then they also have the added cost of childcare and the added cost of having to take care of their family members, which is called the timeout theory. But you have feminization of poverty. You have something called the glass ceiling, as I shared earlier, which is really the cap that females experience that basically doesn't let them move up into higher level, the higher levels of, or the higher echelons of organizational leadership and power. And then the glass escalator is this idea that's associated with the fact that as a male, if I enter a particular niche that's dominated by females, I'm going to go up and be promoted and increase in my wages at a much faster rate than my female counterparts. So let's say I go into education, a historically predominantly female enterprise. I'm going to be a principal in that space much more quickly than females. Okay. Or I'm going to become a head nurse because of my male privilege. I'm going to become a male head nurse well before my female counterparts, some of which may have been there longer than I was. Okay. Or I made more money than my female counterparts. All right. Your book, as I mentioned earlier, it talks about one of the emotional resources that people are denied is that females are denied is safety, emotional and physical safety. So females, your book talks about domestic violence and sexual harassment. This is relatively recent, especially after the second wave of feminism, that this has kind of come onto our radar. It's not relatively recent in that sexual harassment just started in the 1960s, and it always happened to females, but our awareness and our responsiveness to sexual harassment is relatively recent of what that's talking about. Chapter 5 is talking about sexual orientation and inequality. And what I want you all to see here is basically, look, the sexuality we possess is socially constructed and shaped by a lot of social factors. The cultural values and the cultural beliefs of our period of time, of our racial and ethnic group, of our religious groups, of our religious identifications, maybe our national identifications, et cetera, et cetera. So sexuality is very heavily influenced by social factors, but we have within us the plumbing, like we biologically are built and hardwired to want to have sex, like to reproduce, right? Because sexual activity leads to the organism's reproductive right or reproduction. And as an organism, we don't want to die, so we engage in sexual activity to reproduce and keep the species alive, if you're looking at it from a strictly biological perspective. So we lack the sexuality, right, which is basically the direction that our sexuality is going to go, but that's influenced by the social factors and the cultural beliefs and value systems that undergird the society. But we don't necessarily have a lot of say over how our sexuality individually, okay, without society having a say in that. And I'll give you some examples of this, okay? What's normal or abnormal varies across space and time historically. So normal sex, right, whatever normal sex is defined socially in the sense of, like, society determines that who and what kind of sex you can have. So it tells you you can't have sex with someone who's 15 if you're 30. If you're a 16-year-old, you can't have sex with a 45-year-old. Like that 45-year-old is going to get arrested. That's called child molestation. It's called child rape. So society influences and determines who you can have sex with. It determines who you can have sex with based on age. Let's say you're 18 and your girlfriend's 16, or you're 18 and your boyfriend's 16. That could be a crime in some states, right? It also, society has a say over what kind of relations you have in terms of race. So historically, you had anti-misogyny laws, which are basically laws that didn't allow you to marry outside of your race or to have sex with people outside of your race, right? And the relations you can have, you can't have sex with your dad. You can't have sex with your sister, right? Like, those things happen. People are sexually molested and sexually abused, but those are all illegal because society says that that's not an acceptable thing for us to do as human beings. Society also influences what kind of the quantity of partners you have. There's a stigma around women who have many sexual partners historically. I don't know if that's changed too much because now I'm 45, but historically, women who have many sexual partners are not necessarily like praised. They're kind of looked down upon, sometimes even given pejorative terms. The quantity of sex, like how much sex you can have, is socially influenced. I mean, maybe also biologically, because when you're 16, well, actually when you're 18, hopefully you're not 16 having sex, but if you're 18 having sex, you're probably gonna have a lot more sex than when you're 52, because the hormones and the biological functions are just different at those ages and at those stages in the life course, where you can have sex, right? So you can have sex in the bedroom, but you can't have sex in the back seat. Right, you can't have sex in a classroom. You can have sex on a camera now if you have like OnlyFans or whatever. I don't know what that is, but you know like where you can have sex, who you can have sex with, the number of people you can have sex with, how you enjoy sex is socially influenced. Historically, we had anti-sodomy laws, that homosexuals were punished for transgressing, and then even why we have sex, right? Like that's socially influenced, there was for a very long period in American history, there was a stigma or a taboo around people having sex for pleasure, just to have sex with someone because you want to have sex with them. That was totally looked down upon. Now we have Bumble and Tumblr, and I don't know any of those apps, everybody. I have no idea about that. I'm a married man, and I love my wife and I'm faithful, but at the same time, these dynamics have really kind of changed historically. All right, so from a sociological perspective, what's important is not necessarily the cause of our sexuality, but the social structures and values that we arrange around the sexuality we demonstrate. And like I said before, homosexuals and members of the LGBT community have historically experienced a lot of discrimination, mostly and by and large derived from the heteronormativity and compulsory heterosexuality that's basically been imposed. Kind of moving through a couple of other places, in other places and other times, the Greek empires, the Roman empires, homosexual relations were not frowned upon. There were certain rules. So, for example, an older male would be the one penetrating the younger male if you were in Rome. Okay, it was unheard of to be an older male being penetrated, but you have active passive distinctions, right, between who was doing what within these relationships. You have currently, people, it's the book, the chapter talks about the difficulty in identifying who is homosexual, who's a member of the LGBTQ community, because first of all, there's difficulty in whether or not people come out. And then, there's also the self-identification. So individuals going into prison, male prison rape is a real phenomenon. People going into prison and being raped is a very real threat for individuals. But a lot of people in prison are not raping for sexual gratification, but for power. And a lot of individuals who engage in homosexual activity within prisons do not define themselves as homosexuals, even though they engage in homosexual activity. So is there a way to not be homosexual, but be engaging in homosexual activity, right? Like there's all this ambiguity around that. Some of the research that Alfred Kinsey had, and this is very dated research, but it's still just a classic kind of staple to the discussion around sexual orientation, is queer theory, which is basically that our sexual identification, our sexuality is not a binary. It's not gay or straight, but it's actually a continuum. So there is a greater and a lesser heterosexuality. There's a greater and a lesser homosexuality. And so individuals can be, right, somewhat somewhere on this continuum. But it's not that, like you're gay and you're straight, or I was gay and now I'm straight. It's because it's basically this idea that individuals have varying degrees of attraction to the same sex and the opposite sex. So that's queer theory in a nutshell. You also have, and that would explain, for example, how, Caitlyn Jenner came out, and that's a transsexual. Okay, that's an individual who underwent sexual reassignment surgery, but that would also explain some of the sexual orientation that Caitlyn Jenner had, right? Because Caitlyn Jenner for a very long period of time was heterosexual in the activities that he was engaging in as a male, but now as a female is engaging in different activities. So homosexuality was listed as a mental illness in the American Psychological Association's DSM-4 or DSM-3 in 1973. It was listed as a mental disorder. You also have these terms called heteronormativity or heterosexism, which is basically the pressure and the pull that individuals are subjected to be heterosexual from religious institutions, family institutions, educational institutions, and even political institutions, which basically pressure individuals to conform to a heteronormative perspective and presentation of self. Okay, and so it takes a lot out of individuals to challenge those systems. You have compulsory heterosexuality, and it's reinforced again by these kind of ads, and then again by religion and by some of these other spaces. Okay. I've been talking quite a bit already. I will stop there. I hope that everybody is able to find value in this great recording. Continue to do your best. I'm proud of all of you. Have a wonderful week.